The auction yard buzzed with restless energy, a place where voices rose and fell like waves crashing against the shore. Men leaned against wooden fences, their boots kicking up dust, their faces worn from years of hard work and sun. Horses shuffled in pens, some stamping impatiently, others flicking their tails as though they too understood what fate awaited them. Among the strong and spirited stood one creature that looked nothing like the rest. He was small for his breed, his ribs outlined beneath a dull, mud-caked coat. His mane hung tangled, his eyes lifeless, as if the will to fight had long since abandoned him. Each step he took seemed uncertain, his legs trembling as though they might collapse beneath the weight of his own body. The auctioneer's gavel struck, echoing sharply above the murmurs. He rattled off numbers with practiced precision, selling horses swiftly, the crowd cheering when a fine stallion fetched a high price. Yet when the broken horse was led forward, silence fell. The animal stumbled, nearly falling as the handler jerked the rope impatiently. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Not worth a feed bag." Another voice chimed in, "That one's good for glue and nothing more." The auctioneer cleared his throat and forced a smile, though even his tone lacked conviction. "All right then, who'll give me 50? 50 for this fine horse." His words hung in the air, mocked by the snickers that followed. No hands rose. He dropped quickly, desperation creeping in. 20 then? 10. 5. Still, the crowd remained motionless, their attention drifting to conversations more interesting than the ragged animal before them. Finally, with a shrug, he said, $1. Do I hear $1? For a moment it seemed even that price would go unclaimed. The horse shifted uneasily, his ears twitching at the cruel laughter, his gaze dropping to the ground as if ashamed. Then, from the back of the crowd, a hand rose. The gesture was steady, deliberate. Heads turned toward a man, standing slightly apart from the others. His clothes were plain, worn at the seams. His face was shadowed by the brim of a hat, but his posture carried quiet resolve. The auctioneer blinked in surprise before slamming the gavel. "Sold. For $1. Murmurs rippled again, this time tinged with disbelief. "He actually bought it," someone whispered. "A fool's bargain," another sneered. But the man stepped forward calmly, pressing a coin into the handler's palm before taking the rope. His movements were slow, unthreatening, as though aware of how fragile the horse had become. The crowd watched, curiosity mixing with ridicule, but he paid them no mind. Instead, he crouched slightly, extending his hand to brush against the horse's neck. The animal flinched, then stilled, uncertain. For the first time that day, there was no mocking laughter, only silence as the man whispered words no one else could hear. The horse raised his head fractionally, his dull eyes meeting the man's. Something unspoken passed between them, faint but undeniable. With gentle pressure on the rope, the man began to lead the horse away from the ring. The animal stumbled, his legs wobbling, but the man did not tug or scold. Instead, he slowed, adjusting his stride, so that each step felt possible, achievable. Children peered through the rails, wide-eyed. One boy tugged at his father's sleeve and asked, "Why'd he buy it?" "It's broken." The father chuckled and shook his head, but the man overheard, and without turning, he answered softly enough for only those nearby to hear. "Sometimes the broken just need someone to believe in them." The words lingered like a faint echo as he walked the horse past rows of wagons and men shaking their heads. Dust rose around them, the clamor of the auction fading behind. With every step, the contrast between man and animal grew clearer, the man's steady patience beside the horse's trembling fragility. Yet somehow, together, they seemed less mismatched than expected. The road stretched ahead, sunlight bleeding through scattered clouds, the air thick with the scent of earth and hay. Each hoof step was uncertain, yet forward nonetheless. The horse's breathing was shallow, ragged, but the man's presence created a rhythm, a fragile tether holding despair at bay. The farmhands and ranchers who had jeered moments ago were left in the distance, their laughter already fading, their words insignificant against the quiet determination of the man who had spent a single dollar. The horse stumbled again, nearly collapsing. The man paused, kneeling swiftly, his hand firm beneath the trembling neck. He whispered words of reassurance, his voice low and steady, almost like a prayer. The horse's ears flicked, catching the sound, and though the animal could not understand language, he seemed to recognize the intent. Slowly, shakily, he pushed himself upright again. The man remained beside him, never rushing, never forcing. This was not about speed. It was about survival. And in that fragile partnership, something unseen began to stir. The horse, once dismissed as worthless, had been claimed by someone who saw more than bones and scars. The man, carrying burdens unspoken, had chosen to place hope in what others had thrown away. The road ahead promised hardship. The horse was weak, his body worn from years of neglect, and the man himself bore no signs of wealth or ease. Yet as they moved onward, side by side, there was a sense that this meeting had not been chance. The laughter of the crowd was behind them now, replaced by the quiet sound of hooves striking earth, and the steady rhythm of a man who refused to let go. The sky above shifted, clouds parting to reveal a streak of golden light. It fell across the path before them, illuminating dust particles that floated like sparks in the air. For a moment, it seemed as if the world itself paused, offering a glimpse of something greater than the sum of its parts. The horse lifted his head, not high, but higher than before. His eyes, once dulled, flickered faintly with something that might have been recognition. The man saw it and allowed a rare smile to cross his face. He did not speak this time, but his silence carried meaning. The beginning of a journey neither had expected but both desperately needed. Step by step, they continued down the road, leaving behind the place where rejection had defined them. The destination was uncertain, but for the first time, there was movement toward something more. The auction faded into memory, its jeers and judgments swallowed by distance. What remained was the bond, fragile yet undeniable, between a man who had chosen to believe and a horse who had been given a second chance. The path stretched ahead, and though neither knew where it would lead, both understood that the story was far from over. The road to the man's farm was long, stretching between fields where dry grass bent in the breeze. With each mile, the horse's legs threatened to give out, and more than once he faltered so hard that the rope slipped through the man's hands. Yet the man never cursed, never struck, only steadied the trembling creature and urged him forward with quiet patience. When at last the farm came into view, a patchwork of weathered fences, a sagging barn, and land that looked as weary as its owner, there was no grandeur to greet them, only the promise of shelter and rest. The horse's ears flicked at the sight of the barn. Though plain, it was the first place in a long time that did not reek of fear or indifference. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of hay. The man led the horse into a stall, the wood rough but sturdy, the floor lined with straw that rustled beneath weakened hooves. The horse stood uncertainly, shifting his weight, his eyes darting as though expecting another blow or command. Instead, the man knelt to set down a bucket of water, the sound of liquid sloshing softly in the dim light. The horse hesitated, nostrils flaring, then lowered his muzzle and drank greedily until the last drop vanished. The man watched in silence, a faint relief crossing his features, though his eyes betrayed the worry he carried. This was not just a rescue. It was a gamble against despair. Over the following days, the rhythm of care began. The horse was too weak to stand for long, so the man stayed nearby, brushing dirt from his coat with slow, deliberate strokes. The first attempts were met with flinches, the horse pulling away as if each touch recalled the sting of the lash. Yet the man persisted, never harsh, never hurried. He hummed tuneless melodies, his voice low and steady, filling the stall with a presence that was patient rather than demanding. Gradually, the horse's trembling eased, and he allowed the brush to pass over him without fear. Feeding was harder. At first, the horse ignored the oats and hay, turning his head as though the effort of chewing was too great. The man tried again and again, even mixing sweet apple slices into the feed. One evening, after hours of refusal, the horse finally bent his head and took a cautious bite. The crunch of apple echoed like a small victory in the stillness. The man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and whispered, "That's it. That's the start." Nights on the farm were long. Crickets sang in the fields, while the barn settled with creaks and sighs. Sometimes, the man sat outside the stall with his back against the wall, his hat tilted low, staring at the ground as if lost in thoughts too heavy to voice. The horse, half asleep, would flick an ear toward him, sensing his presence. They were two creatures bound by unspoken history, one beaten down by years of labor, the other burdened by regrets that stretched further back than neighbors knew. The man had once owned fine horses, strong and proud, but one tragic accident had stolen not only his best animal, but also his faith in himself. Since then, whispers in town had followed him: failure, bad luck, a man who could not hold onto what mattered. Now, with this frail animal in his care, the reflection of his own downfall stood before him, yet so too did the faintest outline of redemption. It was not long before the neighbors took notice. When they passed by the farm and saw the weak horse staggering in the paddock, they shook their heads. Some laughed, their voices carrying across the fence line. "He wasted his coin." One said, "That nag won't last a month." Others muttered that pity could not turn bones into muscle. The words reached the man, sharp as barbs, but he gave no answer. Instead, he rose each dawn to tend the animal, his silence stronger than their scorn. One morning, as the sun burned mist off the fields, the horse surprised him. Instead of lying in the straw, too weary to stand, he was already on his feet, head raised. His steps were clumsy, uneven, yet there was a determination in them that had not been there before. The man watched with cautious hope as the horse crossed the paddock, pausing only once to regain balance before reaching the far side. A slow smile tugged at the man's lips. He murmured, "You're stronger than they think." But progress was not steady. That evening, a storm rolled in, wind howling against the barn walls. Thunder cracked like whips, lightning splitting the sky. Terrified, the horse thrashed in his stall, striking the walls until splinters flew. His eyes rolled white, breath ragged, hooves clattering against wood. The man rushed in, narrowly avoiding a kick, his arms raised to shield himself. For a moment it seemed impossible. This half-starved animal, wild with fear, might break both itself and him. Yet he pressed forward, his voice rising above the storm. "Easy, easy now." He reached out, his hand steady despite the chaos. Slowly, his tone softened, shifting from command to reassurance, until at last the horse's movement slowed. With one final shudder, the animal pressed his head against the man's chest, quivering but still. The barn fell quiet except for the rain drumming on the roof. The man stood there, one arm draped around the horse's neck, his breath heavy but calm. In that fragile moment, something deeper took root. Trust, tentative but real. The storm outside could rage all it wanted, but inside the stall, man and horse had weathered their first true trial together. The days that followed carried the weight of that night. Each step forward mattered more. Each glance between them carried meaning. The horse began to follow the man willingly, ears tilting toward his voice. When water was drawn, he drank without hesitation. When brush met coat, he leaned into the strokes instead of away. Small victories, but each one a stone in the foundation of something greater. Still, doubts lingered. The man knew the horse's body was frail, its scars deep, recovery uncertain. And in the quiet hours when he sat alone, he wondered if he was only delaying the inevitable. Yet whenever those thoughts came, he remembered the feel of the horse's head resting against his chest, the silent plea for safety. It was enough to keep him moving forward. The neighbors continued their jeers, but the man ignored them. His concern was not for their opinions, but for the fragile life depending on him. As summer edged closer, the land itself seemed to stir with renewal, the grass greener, the sky brighter. And within the paddock, the horse lifted his head higher each day, the dullness in his eyes slowly giving way to a glimmer that refused to die. One evening, as the horizon bled gold and crimson, the man leaned against the fence, watching the horse take a few steady steps across the pasture. They were uneven, halting, but they were his own. The man's voice carried softly across the field. "We'll make it. You and me." The horse paused, ears flicking back toward the sound, before continuing forward into the deepening light. The night settled around them, quiet and still, but beneath its calm lay the promise of transformation. Neither man nor horse knew how far the journey would take them, only that they had begun, bound not by chance but by a shared need for redemption. What others saw as weakness had become the seed of resilience, waiting for the right season to bloom. The days turned into weeks, and the fragile rhythm between man and horse began to harden into something steady. Each morning the sun rose over fields that once seemed barren, now marked by faint hoof prints and the slow progress of a creature learning to trust its own legs again. The horse had gained a little weight, his coat less ragged, though the scars remained visible beneath. He still trembled when startled, but no longer collapsed at the sound of a door slamming. The man, watchful and deliberate, shaped each day into lessons of patience. He carried no whip, no harsh bit, only the rope, his voice, and an unwavering will to coax life where despair had once lingered. Their first attempts at training were cautious. The man led the horse into the pasture, coaxing him to walk small circles. At first, the horse resisted, digging his hooves into the soil as though movement itself was betrayal. But the man was persistent, guiding gently, releasing pressure the moment compliance came. The horse stumbled often, his legs unsure, yet with every correction the man encouraged, not scolded. Sweat gleamed across the animal's thin body, dust clung to his legs, and by the end of the first week, he could walk the pasture without collapsing. The man saw progress where others would have seen only frailty. He told himself, and perhaps the horse too, every step counts. But with progress came setback. One afternoon, as clouds pressed heavy overhead, the horse collapsed mid-stride. His knees buckled, and he crashed onto the earth with a dull thud. The man rushed to his side, heart hammering, fear pressing down as though the very sky might fall. The horse wheezed, his breath shallow, his body shaking with exhaustion. For a dreadful moment, the man thought the journey had ended here, that all his effort had been no more than postponing death. He shouted for the vet, who came quickly, his expression grim. After examination, the verdict fell heavy. This horse is too far gone. Mercy might be the kinder choice. The word struck like a blow. The man stood silent, fists clenched, staring down at the animal lying before him. He remembered the jeers at the auction, the whispers of wasted effort, the storms of doubt that had followed him all his life. Yet in the horse's eyes, glassy though they were, he saw not surrender but a faint flicker of defiance. He knelt, pressing his hand against the trembling neck, and whispered through gritted teeth, "No, not yet. He's more alive now than when I found him. I won't give up on him, and he hasn't given up on me." The vet sighed, shaking his head, but left them to their fate. That night, the man stayed in the stall, refusing to leave. He spoon-fed water, laid extra straw, and murmured encouragement through the hours. The horse fought through the weakness, lifting his head inch by inch, as though answering the man's stubborn refusal. By morning, he managed to stand again, weak but upright. Relief washed over the man in a flood, so strong his knees nearly gave out. From that moment, their bond deepened, forged not by ease but by surviving trial together. Weeks rolled forward, marked by training sessions that grew gradually more demanding. The horse, though scarred, began to move with smoother rhythm. His steps were still uneven, but his body remembered what strength felt like. The man guided him across uneven ground, then short trots, encouraging with soft clucks and steady pressure on the rope. Each time the horse obeyed, the man released, rewarding with silence, with trust. The animal began to anticipate the man's signals, ears flicking back to catch his voice, no longer driven by fear, but by recognition. One evening, while brushing the horse's coat, the man's hand traced a deep scar across the chest. His fingers lingered, his brow furrowed. These were not the marks of accident, but of brutal labor, years of pulling beyond endurance. The realization twisted something inside him. The horse had not simply been neglected. He had been broken by deliberate cruelty, used until his spirit snapped. The man felt his throat tighten, grief mingled with anger. He whispered, not to the horse but to himself, "They threw you away when you could give no more, just as they once wrote me off." The parallel was unmistakable, a mirror held to both their pasts. From that night onward, his training carried new urgency. He was not simply rehabilitating an animal. He was proving, to himself as much as to others, that brokenness was not the end. As the horse began to canter weakly across the pasture for the first time, the man stood at the fence, tears brimming. Neighbors who had mocked now paused to watch, their scorn faltering. One even muttered, almost grudgingly, "Didn't think the beast could move like that." Still, doubts lingered. Strength returned slowly, and the horse tired quickly, his sides heaving after short exertion. But then came the moment that changed everything. A simple run across the field. The horse, startled by a bird lifting suddenly from the grass, bolted instinctively. Instead of collapsing, he pushed forward, his hooves thundering against the earth, his mane whipping back. Though uneven, though imperfect, it was a run, fierce, determined, alive. The man's shout of joy rang across the farm. It was not just movement. It was triumph. Word spread quietly through the community. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, but others grew curious. They remembered the broken nag bought for $1, and now heard whispers of a creature reborn. Pride flickered in the man's chest, not for himself, but for the animal that had clawed its way back from despair. Then came an announcement posted in town. A regional horse exhibition would soon be held, a gathering where farmers and trainers displayed their best animals. For most, it was a place of prestige, a chance to prove breeding lines or training methods. For the man, it stirred something deeper. He saw not competition, but a stage upon which the horse's journey could be validated. If this animal, once mocked and cast aside, could stand proud before that crowd, it would silence not only the jeers of neighbors, but the doubts within his own heart. Yet as he considered the challenge, uncertainty gnawed at him. The horse was stronger, yes, but nowhere near flawless. Would the strain undo all progress? Would the crowd's judgment break what little confidence had been built? He stood by the fence that evening, watching the horse graze peacefully, and whispered, "Can you face them? Can we?" The horse lifted his head, grass falling from his lips, and looked back with an intensity that felt almost like an answer. The decision was not made aloud, but it settled between them like a pact. They would go. They would face the crowd once more, not as a spectacle of failure, but as proof that resilience could outshine rejection. The man knew the path ahead would demand more work, more patience, more courage than either of them had yet given. But the thought of it filled him not with dread, but with resolve. The horse shifted, taking a few confident steps across the field as twilight deepened. The man's gaze followed, his chest tight with anticipation. Their journey had brought them from despair to the edge of something greater, and though the outcome remained uncertain, the course was set. The exhibition loomed on the horizon, a crucible where scars would be tested, where faith would either falter or shine. Together, they would walk into it, bound not by perfection, but by the undeniable strength of survival. The morning of the exhibition dawned crisp and bright, the air carrying the scent of trampled grass and polished leather. Wagons rattled into the fairgrounds. Horses gleamed under the sun, their coats brushed to perfection, muscles rippling with every step. Owners walked proudly beside them, chins high, eyes scanning the crowd for admiration. Among the polished and proud, one man led a horse that seemed almost out of place. Though stronger now than the day he had been bought for $1, the animal still bore the faint outlines of ribs, the scars etched across his chest visible even beneath the shine of a brushed coat. His gait was careful, steady, not flawless. Yet in his eyes burned a quiet fire, a defiance that had not been there before. The man kept his hand light on the rope, his voice low and steady, offering reassurance with each step. Around them, whispers swelled. Some recognized the pair, recalling the day of the auction when laughter had followed their exit. "That's the same nag," one scoffed. "He'll embarrass himself." Others were quieter, their eyes lingering on the horse's scars, curiosity mixing with doubt. The man heard every word, but his focus never wavered. This was not about them. It was about proving, to himself and to the creature beside him, that rejection did not have to be the end. When their turn came, the arena seemed vast, the crowd some pressing in like a storm. The horse hesitated at the entrance, ears flicking back, legs trembling as old memories surged, whips, jeers. the auctioneer's gavel striking like a sentence. For a moment he froze, eyes wide, the shadow of despair threatening to swallow him whole. The man stepped close, laying a firm hand against his neck. His voice was steady, almost a whisper. "You're not alone. Not anymore." The horse's ears twitched. Slowly, uncertainly, he took a step forward. Then another. The sand crunched beneath his hooves, the light glared bright, and the crowd fell into a hush. Every scar, every mark of hardship was on display. There was no hiding the past, only the choice to move through it. The man walked with him, guiding gently, allowing the animal to set his own rhythm. At first, the gait was uneven, faltering. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the stands. But then, as though fueled by the memory of nights survived and storms endured, the horse's stride lengthened. His legs found strength, his head lifted higher, and his steps grew steady. It was not the effortless grace of a prize stallion. It was something rawer, more powerful, resilience given form. The horse trotted, hooves striking with determination, mane lifting in the breeze. The man's eyes glistened as he matched the rhythm, his voice murmuring encouragement. Silence spread through the crowd, the skepticism replaced by a tension that bordered on awe. They were witnessing not perfection, but triumph over despair. Then came the final test. A small jump stood at the far end of the arena, modest by usual standards, but daunting for an animal once too weak to stand. The horse slowed, ears flicking nervously, his chest rising with heavy breaths. The man tightened his grip slightly, leaning close enough for his words to carry. "You can. Trust yourself." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Then the horse surged forward, gathering what strength he had. His body lifted, legs stretching, clearing the obstacle by the narrowest margin. He landed hard, stumbling, but recovered, pushing forward with stubborn resolve. The crowd erupted, not laughter, not ridicule, but applause that rang like thunder. Some stood, clapping until their palms stung. Others wiped at their eyes, the emotion too sharp to disguise. The horse's ears flicked at the sound, his head rising higher still, as though he understood at last that he was no longer a creature of rejection, but of triumph. The man's chest swelled with a pride so fierce it nearly broke him. He walked the horse from the arena, his hand never leaving the scarred neck. Whispers followed, but they carried no scorn now. Instead, there was admiration, even reverence. The vet who had once suggested mercy stood among them, silent, his eyes glistening. Neighbors who had mocked stared in stunned silence, unable to reconcile the creature before them with the one they had dismissed. As the day waned and the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the man led the horse back to the quiet of the farm. The fairgrounds lay behind them, yet the memory of applause still echoed like a promise. In the fading light, the horse moved more freely, his stride less burdened, his spirit unchained. The man removed the rope and watched as the animal trotted into the pasture. For the first time, the horse broke into a run not born of fear or pain, but of sheer will. His mane streamed behind him, his body silhouetted against the setting sun, every scar illuminated like a badge of survival. The man leaned against the fence, his heart heavy and full all at once. He whispered, the words carried on the wind, "I paid $1, but you gave me back my life." The horse lifted his head at the sound, ears pricking, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed he understood. The distance between them was vast, yet the bond uniting them was unbreakable. Night crept over the farm, stars pricking the darkening sky. The man lingered by the fence, watching as the horse grazed peacefully. No longer the trembling creature led from an auction yard, but a symbol of resilience. The jeers, the doubts, the storms, they had been endured and overcome. What remained was a story written not in trophies or ribbons, but in scars turned into strength. And though their journey was far from over, its first great chapter had closed with triumph. The horse was no longer a discarded relic of labor, and the man no longer a figure of quiet failure. Together, they had defied the weight of rejection, proving that sometimes the smallest chance, a single coin, a single act of faith, could alter everything. The wind rustled through the fields, carrying with it a sense of peace, as though the land itself acknowledged the transformation it had witnessed. The man turned at last, heading toward the barn, but paused once more to look back. The horse stood tall beneath the stars, scars gleaming faintly in the silver light. It was a picture he would carry always, proof that belief could turn despair into hope, that brokenness did not define the end of a story. As the farm settled into silence, a final thought lingered, unspoken but heavy with truth. Sometimes the greatest victories are not in grand arenas or dazzling displays, but in the simple act of standing tall after being cast aside. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.